Good evening, everyone. My name is Daphna Rabinovich, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the Giller Book Club, the 11th in a series of 14. Please check our website for more information because you don't want to miss a single one. Please make sure to have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible experience. It is my profound pleasure to introduce you to our interviewer tonight, Merilyn Simonds. And I know Merilyn, and I know it's going to be an incredible hour. Merilyn is the award-winning author of 9 literary books, including the Canadian classic nonfiction novel, The Convict Lover. Her short fiction is anthologized internationally, and her books are published in Europe, the UK, Asia, Canada, and the United States. Her most recent novel is Refuge. It's a story of sanctuary set in Mexico City, the US, and Canada. Woman Watching, a memoir biography of a reclusive Canadian bird woman, will appear next spring. Merilyn was founding artistic director of Kingston, the Writer Fest in Kingston, and develops Canadian programming, including the Giller Spotlight, for a tricultural literary festival in Mexico, where she also lives half the year with her husband. Tonight, Merilyn will be interviewing Emily St. John Mandel, author of The Glass Hotel, shortlisted for the 2020 Scotiabank Giller Prize. There will be lots of fascinating questions and a couple of short readings, and if you'd like to join in on the conversation, please feel free to submit a question using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you submit a question, your name will be entered into a draw to win 2 free Audible titles of your choosing. So please join the conversation. And now I don't want to waste any more of your time. So without further ado, please welcome Merilyn and Emily.
Hello, Daphna. Thank you so much. I've just got something on my screen. I need to, yes, there we go. Hi.
Hey.
It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to everyone who's out there watching, and especially welcome to Emily.
Thank you.
Emily is not keen on effusive personal bios. If you've visited her website, you can see that her bio is quite minimalist. In the course of our conversation, you're going to learn something about her, I hope. But before we do that, I just want to give you the basics of this really extraordinary novelist. Emily has written 5 novels. The 5th, the one we're going to talk about tonight, is The Glass Hotel. It's been translated into 21 languages, was shortlisted for the Giller, as we know, and was selected by President Barack Obama, a prodigious reader, as one of his favorite books of 2020. Her most well-known book, other than the most recent one, is undoubtedly Station 11, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and the PEN/Faulkner Award and won the Toronto Book Award. It's been translated all over the world and will soon be a limited series on HBO Max. So if you're interested in that, you can ask her a question about that later. It is a brilliant and eerily prescient novel about a pandemic, so eerie that when I returned to it last week to read it a second time, I found I actually couldn't read it in the midst of a real life pandemic, but I do highly recommend it. And I also highly recommend that that readers search out Emily's other novels, The Lola Quartet, The Singer's Gun, and Last Night in Montreal. And if you own any of Emily's novels, which you should, because in my opinion, she's a keeper, you must rightly shelve them in your library under M for Mandel, not S for St. John, which is her middle name. So we've got that out of the way. Very, very important detail. So hi, Emily.
Hi. Thank you so much for doing this. Before we talk about the books, I thought I should maybe just explain what happened to my face because I have this vision of the audience staring at bandages and not hearing a word that we're saying.
Right. And being very worried for your welfare.
Yeah, exactly.
Do elucidate.
It's what it looks like. I got in a knife fight. It was pretty intense. No, actually,
well, you do live in New York, so
I do live in New York. It's a tough town. The Brooklyn literary world is pretty heated sometimes. No, it was actually, I had skin cancer and I'm going to be fine. It was completely removed, but it's kind of an elaborate repair job is the situation. So a month in bandages. But yeah, that's what happened there.
It's okay. We can still see your wonderful smile. So, and your facial expression is all there. So,
Or like half of it is there.
Yeah, well, yeah, just kind of the top half
Right,
is missing,
right.
but we're good. So before we start talking about the Glass Hotel, I wondered if we could talk a little bit about you. As you mentioned, you live in New York and you've lived there, I think, most of your adult life, correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
And
It
yet,
just, it goes so fast, but yeah, I've been here for 18
oh,
years,
just
which is
wait.
crazy. I know. I can feel time speeding up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But several of your books, including this one, are set, at least in part, in Canada. And so I wonder if you could just tell us about your roots in Canada and why you return there in your books.
Sure, absolutely. You know, in this sort of green room, when we were talking a minute ago, you mentioned that you're not a particularly nationalistic person, and I'm not either. So I would say that I have, I guess, ultimately a pretty unromantic view of citizenship. I was born with dual citizenship, Canada and the US, because my father was born in California and he immigrated to Canada, before I was born. So I was born and raised in Canada. And although, I do take kind of an unromantic view of these things that I'm Canadian and American because those are my passports. There is the pull of the homeland. Canada was my home country before I knew I was a citizen of anywhere else. So I grew up on and around Vancouver Island, and then Denman Island, which for anybody who's read Station 11, that is the island in the book. I just slightly changed the name. It's really beautiful. It's a tiny island between Vancouver Island and the mainland. Yeah, I spent my life there until I was 18. And then I went to Toronto to go to the School of Toronto Dance Theatre. Contemporary dance was my first career. I did not last that long as a dancer. I was ready for a change. I ended up in New York City because I had a boyfriend there. So yeah, I came to New York City at the age of 22, and I've been here ever since. It's been a while.
So how much did you draw on your childhood in BC in setting the early scenes of the Glass Hotel? Because you were born in Merville, am I saying
Yeah,
that correctly?
you are saying that correctly. Yeah.
Right, just down the coast from Campbell River, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, and so I'm just wondering how much you drew on your own childhood for those early passages in the book.
I drew on it much less for the Glass Hotel than I did for Station 11.
Right.
None of my characters in any of my books are avatars, but I think as novelists, I'm curious if this is your experience too. I think we do inevitably draw on our personal experiences and little shreds of our bios. So in Station 11, what that looked like was two characters in that book, Miranda and Arthur, are from, this thinly disguised Denman Island, British Columbia.
Right.
And then they talk about how when they went to Toronto when they were 18 or 19 years old, that the anonymity of a big city felt like freedom, which was absolutely autobiographical. Denman Island was so beautiful, but it's an island with 1,000 people. And that was not appealing to me when I was a teenager. So, I loved the big city experience, being able to walk down the street and nobody knows anything about you. I found that kind of refreshing at that age. So I definitely drew on that experience in Station 11. In the Glass Hotel, it's a much more remote corner of British Columbia than I ever lived in. Where I mostly grew up on Denman Island, which is beautiful and rural, but not remote. It's more just like inconvenient. It's, a 10-minute ferry ride to Vancouver Island and then a half-hour drive to the nearest town.
Right.
But when I was about 14, my family spent a couple of weeks in Quatsino, which is a tiny hamlet way up north on Vancouver Island. And that's what the village of Cayette is based on. To get to
I looked
Quats,
up Cayette and there
it doesn't
is no
exist,
Cayette,
right?
no.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know why I changed the name. I guess I should have kept it Quatsino. Maybe I felt I didn't really have the right to write about a real place where I hadn't lived or something.
Well, I'll tell you, when you Google Cayette,
Mhm.
you get Quatsino.
Oh, really? Okay. Fiction is bled into reality and now it's
It
the same
has,
place.
it has.
Right.
It's yeah. And
Okay.
actually, I
Interesting.
wonder if you could read a little bit from the beginning
Yeah.
of the novel, which takes place, I think, in Port Hardy, which is kind of the most northerly town on
Yeah.
Vancouver Island, right? Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. That's where you go to school if you grow up in Quatsino/Cayette.
right.
Okay. Sweep me up. Words scrawled in acid paste on one of the school's north windows, the acid marker trembling a little in Vincent's gloved hand. She was 13 years old, and this was Port Hardy, British Columbia, a town on the northernmost tip of Vancouver Island that was somehow less remote than the place where Vincent actually lived. Paul came around the corner of the high school too late to stop her, but in time to see her do it. And now the three of them, Vincent, Paul, Melissa, were silent for a moment, watching thin trails of acid dripping down the glass from several letters. Through the words, the darkened classroom was a mass of shadows, empty rows of desks and chairs. Vincent had been wearing a man's leather glove that she'd found who knows where. Now she pulled it off and let it drop into the trampled winter grass, where it lay like a dead rat, while Paul stood useless and gaping. Melissa was giggling in a nervous way. What do you think you're doing? Paul wanted to sound stern, but to his own ears, his voice sounded high and uncertain. It's just a phrase I like, Vincent said. She was staring at the window in a way that made Paul uneasy. On the other side of the school, the bus driver honked his horn. We can talk about this on the bus, Paul said, although they both knew they wouldn't talk about it at all because he wasn't especially convincing as an authority figure. She didn't move. So I probably should have set that up a little bit. Paul is Vincent's half brother. Merilyn, you're muted.
Yes, there we go. This excerpt introduces Vincent and Paul, right? The brother and sister. Vincent, of course, is a girl, which
Yes.
takes a little bit of getting used to. Why did you call your female character Vincent? Were you intentionally playing with gender?
It was more that I'd recently read a biography of an American poet whose work I really love, Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Right.
And she's one of those poets where even if you think you haven't read her, you might have, because she wrote that poem, I burn my candle at both ends, it will not last the night, but oh, my friends and ah, my foes, it gives a lovely light. And so we talk about burning our candle at both ends, and that's where it came from. She was admirable to me, not just as an artist, but because of the circumstances of her life, which is that she grew up in really kind of dire poverty. And she catapulted herself from that to a completely different life by sheer force of will. So, that's a quality and a skill that I personally admire very much. And it's something that I was trying to kind of echo a little bit in this character in the book I was writing at the time, The Glass Hotel. So
Well,
even
and
though
Vincent does that.
Vincent does that
Yeah,
exactly
yeah.
by very different means, but
Yeah.
she does it. So yeah, it was kind of an homage to this poet I love. I also just really love that name. I think it's beautiful.
It is beautiful. So the other main character in the book is Jonathan. Oh God, I'm not going to pronounce
Alcatus.
Alcatus. I want to pronounce the I, that first I.
Then when you do that, it
Alcatus.
sounds like Al Qaeda, which is like
I know,
yeah,
which is
it's
like
awkward.
the wrong,
Not
the
where we're
wrong
going. Yeah.
reverberation, right? So Jonathan, his brother Lucas also figures in the plot, and it struck me that siblings are important in this book, both Vincent and Paul and Jonathan and Lucas. And then I realized you have 4 brothers and sisters yourself. Do any of them see themselves on the page? And
Oh God, I hope not.
and was siblings? Is that an interest? Was that intentional, or is it?
It's funny.
Accidental?
It's an interest, but it doesn't really feel intentional.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't spot patterns in your own work because you have no objectivity. So it's not until you finish a book that it's like, oh my God, once again, I wrote about music, travel, and sibling relationships. Like, what is up with that? So I've done that several times now. So, I guess there's something there.
Well, they say we all just have one book in us, and we
Yeah,
just keep writing it in different ways.
right. It's like theme and variations. So the same
Yeah,
notes.
exactly.
Yeah, no, there is something to that. Yeah, I'm the second of five, and sibling relationships are just really interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, the other sort of main character that in many ways kind of dominates parts of the book, along with Vincent, is Jonathan.
Mhm.
And the story takes place around the time of the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme scandal, right? And Jonathan seems to be cut from similar cloth. So, what was it about con men, about Ponzi schemes, confidence games that intrigued you? And was that sort of 2008 financial collapse, was that part of the stimulus for this novel?
It was absolutely. Something that I like to emphasize is that every character in this book is completely fictional. But I was fascinated by the Madoff story. I was in New York for the 2008, 2009 economic collapse. My understanding is that Canada was somewhat cushioned from it because Canada
Mhm.
has a stronger regulatory system than the United States does.
Yeah, for the banks.
Yeah, exactly. It was just a little bit
Yeah,
less Wild Westish, where these
yeah,
funds were concerned. It was shocking down here. It felt like we had this pretty solid economy, it was running along, high employment. And then the carpet just got pulled out. And all of a sudden, so many people were unemployed and there were runs on the banks. And it was a really surreal time as I remember it.
yeah.
You'd be a customer of Washington Mutual, and then you'd get an email on a Friday saying that you were now a customer of JP Morgan Chase because your bank had folded. So it was strange. And then during the height of that, when everything was kind of coming undone, this man is arrested, Bernie Madoff, for the most spectacular con. It was a 65 billion with a B dollar US Ponzi scheme. So the scale of it was fascinating.
Incomprehensible,
It's
really.
incomprehensible. Yeah.
Yeah.
But what really drew me in and fascinated me was the fact that the crime required a staff. You don't think about that, but a $65 billion crime, if you're the perpetrator, you're not sitting there at your computer formatting those fake account statements for yourself. You
No.
got people for that, for the same
Yeah.
reason you're not driving your own car, you outsource. So at the time, I had a really great day job for a writer. I was an administrative assistant in a cancer research lab at the Rockefeller University. So, really interesting environment. That's a university that's all science. And it was just this wonderful place. My coworkers were great. They were, no, they were so smart. And I just really enjoyed spending time with them. And what I found myself thinking about was the camaraderie that you have with any group of people who you work with, that kind of sense of shared mission.
Right.
And then when the story broke about Madoff and when it became clear that, these staffers had been involved and 6 or 7 people were arrested, I just found myself thinking how infinitely bizarre that office would be. Like imagine if that shared mission is showing up at work on a Monday to perpetuate a massive crime with your coworkers. That's pretty crazy. So
Yeah.
that was what pulled me in. The first chapter of the book that I wrote was, eventually after 3 really intensive rounds of structural edits, ended up being chapter 10. It's the one that begins with "We had crossed a line," and it's a sort
Oh,
of
yes.
Greek
Yeah.
chorus of office staffers. So yeah, that was.
So you started with the staff.
I did. I started with the
Because that was
staff.
going to be my next question. I mean, I know that you really admire bold structures.
I do.
You were talking about Jennifer Egan in A Visit from the Goon Squad, and how that structure was so compelling, and really Station 11 has an astonishing structure as well.
Thank you.
And this one, I thought, really, did you start the book with the scene of Vincent drowning, or did you write to that point and then think, oh, I could start the book with that?
You know what it was? I did such the revisions on this book were so intense. It was so hard to write. And that was one of the very last chapters that I wrote, was what became chapter 1 in the novel. It just took forever to figure out A, what the book actually was, and B, how to fit all those pieces together.
Do you outline?
No, not at all. Which is
No.
why, which is why it's hard to write these books.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah,
So your process is more intuitive and
it
experiential
is.
then.
It is
Yeah.
more intuitive. And, because I know that at any event like this, a certain number of people in the audience are probably thinking about writing or just starting out writing.
Mhm.
I just want to say quickly, it's not like there's a right way to do this or a wrong way. I don't outline at all because I kind of like the element of surprise, but I have friends who won't sit down and start writing a novel until they know exactly how it's going to end. So, it's just whatever works for you. And
I
this,
tend to outline halfway through, like
okay.
after I get, I don't know, 6 or 8 drafts in, then I'll outline in order to
Yeah, I
figure.
do that
Yeah,
sometimes. It's like a
yeah,
bird's eye view so you can see
yeah,
what you're doing.
yeah, because
Yeah,
you sort of forget everything that's in there. You can't hold it in your brain all at once, right?
right.
Yeah, it is so individual. The other thing that struck me, I mean, the structure, the way it ended up was brilliant, but I
Thanks.
gather it was quite different from the book as you envisioned it going in, right?
Yeah, it was. We were talking a minute ago about bold structures. One of the books that I admire most in the world, structurally, and also because I love the prose, is Cloud Atlas by the British
Right.
author David Mitchell.
Yeah,
And for anybody who
astonishing.
hasn't read it, it has this wonderful symmetry to it where it kind of marches forward and then backward in time. And that was my first idea for this book. I was trying to sort of just to try that structure to make it
Yeah,
symmetrical that
yeah.
way. That is so hard to pull off, and I absolutely did not pull it off. So, my
But
yeah,
it's worth a try.
it was worth a try. Yeah, but it turns out it's really hard to maintain any kind of narrative tension when you're kind of obligated by the structure to return to exactly the same points in time and the same characters in the same order. I just
Right.
couldn't quite make it work. So yeah,
Well,
that was the first attempt, and then the final book I think is the third structure that I came up with.
well, it works wonderfully, and
Thanks.
I mean the mystery in this novel, and it's called a mystery, a thriller. It's who knows what it is, right? It's for other people to put genre titles on the work that a writer does. Um, but this hinges on two simple sentences: "Sweep me up," and "Why don't you swallow broken glass?" They're both chilling sentences, and they're written in a chilling way on glass with acid. How how did the idea of acid graffiti come to you?
There was a problem in the New York City subway about a decade ago where
Yeah.
people were writing on the windows in some kind of like homemade acid markers. And
Wow.
in New York City, I guess it goes back to that, somewhat discredited broken window theory of policing that, they want to avoid the appearance of anarchy. So there's a pretty firm policy that trains don't leave the terminal with graffiti on them. But trains were leaving the terminal with their windows all messed up because nobody could wipe it off. It was acid, it was etching the
Yes, yes,
glass.
yes.
So yeah, I guess that's where I think that's where it came from because it kind of it looks like the glass has been written on with soap. So you see it and you're like, could they not have just wiped down the window? And
Yeah.
no, they actually could not. It's an etching at this
Wow.
point.
Wow. Amazing. Well, the worlds in this novel are unknown to most of us, or at least to me. Drugs, Ponzi schemes, international shipping routes. I mean, they're kind of unknown worlds, and but yet you write them so they feel so entirely authentic.
Thank you.
What's your research process, especially the shipping thing?
Right. What is up with that? That question comes up a lot. I just read a really good book about shipping. It was called
Really?
90% of Everything by a British journalist named
Oh,
Rose George. It just fascinated me. I think it's the combination of scale and invisibility that interests me in the shipping industry. We don't really see that industry because at this point, the ships are so massive and require such deep harbors that they're
mhm.
not downtown anymore. The ships aren't
Right.
pulling into Toronto or New York City. They're
They're
pulling
not in
into Port
harbors.
Elizabeth. Yeah, like
Yeah.
they're peripheral to the places where we
Mhm.
live.
Mhm. That's
So we
true.
don't really see them. And we just kind of take it for granted that everything or most things, on and around us just kind of appear when we need them. And, we tend not to think about the ship or the people who brought this microphone here, for
Yeah.
example, or
Yeah.
who transported my shirt.
Yeah,
So
or the gauze.
yeah, or the gauze, right? Yeah, yeah.
And what about Ponzi schemes? Was that tricky to research?
Oh, sometimes it's hard to really parse where the research begins and just the reading for pleasure ends. I was so fascinated by that crime. So I felt like I knew a fair amount about it just because I'd read so many articles and essays about it before I started writing this book. It was such a thing in New York City. So many people were defrauded here. So it was just kind of in the air for a while. And I feel like it was always in the news, for some time. But then when I decided to write this book that was focused around the fallout and aftermath of the same crime with different characters, again, I just found a couple of really good books about Bernie Madoff's crime.
And it has, for me, it had shades of 1929.
Right.
And the collapse of the banks and that sort of thing there. So it had a really deep historic resonance.
Good.
Quite apart from, the Ponzi scheme thing. I was wondering if you would read another little piece for us.
Sure.
And before I leave, I just want to remind people that if you want to ask a question, get it into the Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. Click on that and put your questions in there. And at around 7:45 or so, we'll, unfortunately, we will, stop our little conversation and because I have 1,000 questions, really.
Right.
And we'll turn it over to the audience, who I'm sure has 10,000 questions. So, okay, if you could read this second part, that'd be great.
Yes, sure. Okay, so to set this up just a little bit, Jonathan Alcaides has been given a very long prison sentence, and he's in the first few years of that sentence. Journalists write to him sometimes. What does it feel like to be sentenced to 170 years? They ask. He doesn't reply to this because he knows the answer will sound insane. It feels like delirium. One morning when he was 25, Alcaides woke up with a high fever. He was living alone on 70th Street back then and had nothing in the apartment to treat a fever, so he had to stagger outside to the nearest bodega. He bought aspirin with some difficulty, too hot, the sidewalk unsteady under his feet, made it back to his building and up the stairs to the landing, where he found himself baffled by the mechanics of opening his apartment door. There was a key in his hand and a lock on the door, and he understood in an abstract way that these two things fit together. But he couldn't figure out how to make it work, and that was how he knew he was delirious. For how long did he stand there? 5 minutes, 10, a half hour, who knows? Eventually, he made it inside. In the courtroom in Manhattan, 37 years later, the judge says the number, 170 years, and there's a vertiginous sensation of movement, time rushing away from him toward that impossible destination, the year 2179. He understands that he'll spend the rest of his life in prison, but it's the same confusion he felt at that moment of delirium in his 20s. The rest of his life and prison are two pieces that don't fit together, the lock and the key, an incomprehensible equation. American prison sentences are intense.
Well, yeah, 170 years, because he's not a young man either when this happens. He's quite a bit older.
Right. And what I love, like, this is just a totally irrelevant detail that I found kind of amazing in my research. For technical reasons, he was sentenced to 3 years of probation following that 50-year prison sentence, which, that's a ghost story.
Yeah. Well, and you told me when we were talking about what passage you were going to read that part of this section, not the prison part, but the feverish amnesia part, is something that draws out of your own life. And so I wonder if you want to talk about that a little bit, the way real life bleeds into writing, even when it's fiction.
Right. The way you Google Quatsino and kayak comes up.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Just this, I think we always just pull in these little details from our lives. And when I was, I think 18, I made like 19, 20, maybe 21, I lived alone in this really small apartment in Toronto. It was amazing because there were no roommates, which felt like such a luxury at that point in my life.
Yeah.
And I got sick one winter. I woke up in the morning and I had a really high fever. I realized right away I was really sick. No Tylenol or anything like that in the apartment. So it was exactly like that passage. I put on my coat and went down to the corner store, got Tylenol or something, came back up, made it inside the building, climbed the stairs, stood in front of my apartment door with a key and couldn't figure out how to get in. And that was when I realized I was delirious. I don't know how long I stood there, but yeah, it was a really strange moment that I think is just stuck in memory because it was so surreal.
Are there any other parts in the book that you can think of that you drew from your own life?
I'm sure there are. I can't think of any off the top of my head,
Yeah.
but
Well, if they
yeah.
come to you. The part that you read was from a chapter called Counter Life, and I'm so interested in this aspect of the novel. It's that notion of double lives, shifting worlds, and it runs through the book, and it struck me so much that I started keeping track of all the
Right.
phrases that you use to talk about that notion. There's the kingdom of money, altered worlds, shadowlands, ghost version, parallel universe, layered and overlapping countries. When Al-Qaeda goes to prison, he mentally escapes by living what he calls a counter life. Others are haunted by the ghost life that they've never lived or they're never going to get to live. And at one point, somebody says it's possible to know something and not know something. And in another place, two things can be true at the same time. So the book is filled with shifting realities and kind of an uncertainty about the real world. Can you talk about your fascination with that or your exploration of it in this book?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a few things going on there. To start with the counter life, that's an idea that I find really interesting. This idea of the life you didn't live. And you can think of the large inflection points, the life where you went to a different school or married a different person or emigrated instead of staying or vice versa. But there are also, so many little ones. I sometimes think I can trace my whole current life to a moment in Toronto when I happened to pick up a new, like iMagazine, read a review of a book, and like through a long series of circuitous events, that's what got me to New York City. And, so if I hadn't picked up that magazine, would I still be a dancer in Toronto? Like it's possible. So, I think we all have those counter lives. So that's an idea that really interests me. It's also an homage to Philip Roth, whose work I find to be somewhat hit or miss. I'm not an uncritical fan, but I loved his novel, The Counter Life. I think it came out in the 80s, and it's just a fantastic book. That's kind of like variations on one man's life and, different ways that he could have lived, different people who he could have been. So I loved that. And then some of the kind of shifting unreality goes back to what we talked about earlier around the structure of the book.
Mhm.
So I realized early on that although I really was not nailing the structure, I was really struggling to figure out what it was. I knew it was going to be pretty complicated. And when I have that realization in a book, as I'm writing it, I start to think in terms of, well, what would make this whole complicated thing more cohesive? How can I draw everything together? And that's where themes can be really useful. So I
Mhm.
thought, well, if I'm writing about a Ponzi scheme, by default, I'm writing about money. So every section of the book should be concerned with money in one way or another. At the same time, I had this thread that I was playing with around the ghosts that Jonathan's seen in prison. And at first, that was not a big part of the book. He's seen the ghosts of investors who've died.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to suggest a deteriorating mental state and kind of, introduce some ambiguity around whether those ghosts are actually real. If you can use the word real in relation to a
A
ghost.
ghost.
Yeah, it's a little tricky. But then I thought, well, maybe that could be another organizing principle. Maybe every section of the book could also relate in some way to ghosts, or maybe more broadly speaking, the idea of hauntedness. Because I think we sometimes, we use that phrase ghost story, in kind of a classical way, usually. Like we think about the kinds of ghosts who Jonathan sees in prison. They're like
Yeah.
transparently wafting around the prison yard or whatever.
Yeah.
But what if your life is haunted by the ghost of the life you didn't live? That's an interesting kind of ghost story. Or what if you're just haunted by a bad decision, as Paul is? Or in Vincent's case, haunted by the possibility that you knew more than you were willing to admit to yourself. So it was just really interesting in this book to think about the different permutations of what that phrase ghost story could mean, different ways of being haunted. And then that idea of knowing and not knowing something at the same time, that's just a psychological state that I find really interesting. And I think that we all fall prey to it. Like, most of us are hopefully not perpetuating massive Ponzi schemes, but for an example in your own life, think about your most self-absorbed friend. Like we all have one, the monologuist.
Yeah.
You might know that there's something a little bit off about that person, but choose not to know it because you value the friendship. So, I'm really interested in that state.
Well, and to me that there's a short step to then the conning notion, right? People
Yeah.
conning themselves in a way,
Yeah, absolutely.
and conning other people. I mean, I think of Vincent, um, who is this small town girl who ends up as a jet setter, as a trophy, not a wife, but a trophy partner, um, whose entire life will collapse with the Ponzi scheme, and she takes on a totally different reality. And so, but for a good part of that, she's conning the people around her that she is that wealthy, cultured person that she
Right.
appears to be.
But then that's a really interesting thing because I was thinking about that in terms of performance, where,
Right.
she's a bartender before,
Yeah.
at the time in her life when she meets Jonathan, before she's kind of swept away into this kingdom of money. That is such a performative job. Any customer service position, you're kind of performing for tips. And it was interesting to just think of that performance just being kind of adapted to, it feels simplistic to call it a job, but there is absolutely a mercenary quality to a relationship with Jonathan. That it's like the performance continues in a slightly different vein. And, she's just doing this different job at a very high level.
Well, and the other thing that a term that you've used is consensual reality. And I found that really interesting because it's linked in to what we've been talking about, right?
Right.
Is that people agree to agree that these are the facts of the times or the moment or the world in which we're living, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to sort of expand
Sure. Yeah.
on your feelings about that word?
About consensual reality. I think about it most often in terms of the political situation in the United States, which is a tragedy. And, I don't know, I don't know how a country holds together when citizens cannot agree on the basic facts of reality. But, it's no longer a case of reasonable people disagreeing on policy. Like that's sane. That's how it used to be.
Yeah.
It's people who just have a completely different understanding of what reality is and what happened and what video footage actually shows. And it's it's something I find myself thinking about a lot here. It's been such a bad time here politically. It was up until the Biden administration, but the hangover of the Trump administration is still with us, and it's not going away.
No.
We all saw what happened on January 6th, and that was it's just been it's been something that's been very much on my mind living here.
Well, for me, it made the Glass Hotel have just another whole level of meaning, because politically, he wasn't that different from Jonathan in the financial world, right? Trump was doing similar things, and so it had a political gloss that it might not have had if it had been released into a different world.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. And, that is an interesting parallel that I hadn't really thought about. But Yeah, of course. You know, the Trumpists, they just long to believe.
Yeah.
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 Which is the same
Um,
thing that requires a con to work. You have to want to believe it.
yes. Yes. So again, it comes back to that that notion of a person's capacity for self-delusion.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Which I
Yeah.
think we all have. Hopefully not quite to that
Yes.
degree.
um, one of the things that I'm just going to mention briefly, because we're going to be going to the audience questions shortly, but if I'm not mistaken, Miranda from the Glass Hotel arrives from Station 11, right?
She
And
does. Yeah.
so it's almost as if the Georgia flu never happened. And this is Miranda's counter life in, you know, in this shipping company, which for half a second when that occurred to me, I wondered if the whole novel, The Glass Hotel, was just a fever dream from somebody who was suffering from the Georgia flu.
Yeah. Miranda's last moments in that beach in
Yes,
Malaysia.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's a curious thing. So tell me about why you did that, or what was the impulse?
You know, the impulse was I just fell in love with a couple of the characters in Station 11. I was really attached to Miranda and really attached to Clark. And I knew that I wanted to use Miranda again in a future book,
Mhm.
which, and I feel this isn't a spoiler because Station 11 came out in 2014, was kind of a challenge because Miranda dies in the flu pandemic. So I thought, well, maybe I'll think of these books as sort of parallel universes. So I tried to set that up actually toward the end of Station 11. There's a section where two of the characters in one of the post apocalyptic chapters they're sitting beside the road and they're just kind of playing this game that they've clearly been playing for years, where they just riff on all counter lives, basically, you know, different versions of
Yeah,
reality.
yeah.
You know, imagine a world, for example, where the flu pandemic never happened. So I was trying to lay the groundwork at the end of that book for just this idea of parallel universes. And then I tried to echo that at the beginning of The Glass Hotel, or I should say early on in The Glass Hotel, where there's a scene where Vincent is kind of wandering aimlessly around Manhattan shopping. And she's playing the same game, but just with herself. You know, imagine a world where that terrifying new flu hadn't been quite so swiftly contained and civilization had collapsed. So I was trying to lay out that kind of counter life idea just so I could use this character who I really liked again. And, you know, it was just kind of interesting to use her in a very different way. Where in Station 11, it's a lot of Miranda's personal life, her marriage,
Mhm.
and then her art, you know, around the graphic novel.
Mhm.
And during that period, she has a really interesting job that I don't really get into in Station 11 because you have to cut so much for the sake of velocity in any given
Yeah,
novel.
yeah.
So yeah, it was just interesting to focus on her working life in the Glass Hotel.
So did you already have the Glass Hotel in mind when you were writing Station 11?
You know, the short answer is that I actually don't know. You know, I am
Okay.
like what I would have told you and what I was going with in interviews until fairly recently was that I started thinking about and writing the Glass Hotel sometime after Station 11 came out. It came out in 2014. It's like around that period, I was
Yeah, yeah,
thinking
yeah.
about what comes
Yeah.
next. But then I came across this old notebook the other day while I was cleaning my office. And it had a note from 2011, which was idea for a novel, Fallout from Ponzi scheme. So I
Wow.
can't tell you. I don't know.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I
When
think, yeah.
when I traced my last novel, Refuge, I found the first page of that novel in my 2004 notebook.
Wow.
It's bizarre, right?
Yeah.
How these, but obviously one's brain is working, and that brings me very smooth segue to the first question from the audience. Do you already have or did you already have the plot to the the Glass Menagerie, the Glass Hotel mapped out when you wrote the Lola Quartet? I noticed a passing reference to Jonathan as well as a couple of other elements.
That's interesting. I didn't know there were more elements other than the reference to Jonathan. No, I didn't really have that in mind, but I wrote the Lola Quartet during the 2008, 2009 economic collapse. So that felt like the subject of the book. It was felt like we were living in these kind of shocking historical times. Although, God, compared to the pandemic, that feels like small potatoes. But at the moment, it felt quite intense. And the Madoff story was very much on my mind as I was writing the Lola Quartet. So I do remember just kind of dropping in that sort of Madoffian character, Alcatus,
Right.
who's, yeah, I don't think he ever actually appears in the book. It's more like people around him, and he's just kind of a plot point. Yeah, so I guess and then when I was thinking about writing this book, writing a book that was more narrowly focused around a Ponzi scheme, I just remember looking back and thinking, well, I already created that character for the Lola Quartet, so let me just bring him in.
That's I love that because it reinforces my notion that really we should read all of a writer's work, right? Because all those threads are going to be there. So someone would like to know, and this is an interesting question. I'm curious, this is Reva. I'm curious how you feel when you're writing. Are you excited? Are you sometimes lost or depressed or confused? Or is it just go, 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 go?
It depends on the day. I definitely have these sort of magical, effortless moments where I'm just like writing, but to be clear, it's terrible because it's the first draft, where I'm just writing. There's that feeling of flow, which is magical. There are other moments when it does feel kind of depressing and like kind of a grind. There were a lot of moments for me of doubt, of thinking, I really don't have the talent to pull off this book I'm trying to write. And that kind of happens every time, to be honest. It feels like part of the process. So yeah, I'm all over the place in that way. Sometimes it's really fun and sometimes it's really not. At this point, though, I've actually written 6 novels at this point, and I've finished every novel that I've set out to write. So that helps a lot, knowing that even if it's not a great writing day, I'm in a process that will result in a novel eventually. I just don't know what kind of novel it'll be.
So you don't have a bottom drawer filled with
I don't.
unpublished novels.
Which, no disrespect to people who do.
No.
I know a lot of novelists who have that.
Yeah. So this also, you're very good at the segue. One of the questions is, are you working on another book?
I am. Yeah, I'm really, really far along in another book, which will be announced later on this month and comes out in April. I wrote a really crazy novel during the pandemic that I'm excited about.
Well, and I know you can't say the title, so don't bother asking the question, folks. But we will wait, with bated breath for the announcement.
Thank you.
So, and the next question comes from Leila, and she says, it feels like we're supposed to feel a certain level of sympathy for Alcatus, even though he has committed such an elaborate fraud and people have died by suicide as a result. Was that to bring a level of humanity to the character, or do you really think that he deserved sympathy and, by extension, Madoff et al.?
Right. That's a good question. More the former. It was a character development strategy. So, I mentioned at the outset that every character in this book is fictional. The Madoffian character was by far the hardest one to write. He was the only character who'd done something real, where all the other characters, Alcatus's family is completely different from Madoff's family. Alcatus's staff is completely different from Madoff's staff. The companies are different. Madoff never owned a hotel. But then, you get to the man himself, so to speak, at the center of the crime. Bernie Madoff was the most unbelievably uninteresting person. You read if you read any of the prison interviews, he's just he was the most self-serving kind of garden variety sociopath. I never got the impression that he really cared about what had happened. So then that kind of posed a pretty big problem as a novelist, which is, how do I write an interesting person who committed that same crime? So I really had this feeling of creating it, creating the character from scratch. Like there was just no template to work with. So I thought, well, how do I prevent this guy from being a similarly boring character? Because if you write a character who's pure evil or like as sociopathic as Madoff was, that's pretty boring. That's a Disney mustache twirling villain. There's just not a lot there. So I thought, well, there's got to be some humanity to this guy. to keep me interested, let alone keep the reader interested. So I have him really truly love his first wife. Now he has real friendships, although he does steal his friend's retirement savings. And his relationship with Vincent is not black and white. She is kind of a trophy wife. It's a very mercenary arrangement. At the same time, there's real affection and they're friends. So, yeah, I really appreciate the question because I did work really hard to bring some humanity to that character. And no, I had no sympathy for Madoff.
Okay. I'm gonna conflate two questions here because they both center around place and Vancouver Island and the islands around there. One person is wondering why you chose to fictionalize some of the place names, but not others, like Port Hardy. And the other person was just on the ferry to Denman and Hornby Islands yesterday.
Oh, wow.
And so she's talking about the transition from mainland is kind of slow and languid when you're, and I've traveled those ferries a lot too. So it's an amazing transition from the bustle of Vancouver, to the islands. And so she's wondering if the themes of arrival and departure were in your mind while you were writing The Glass Hotel. So maybe first, if you could answer the why you fictionalized Cayette, for instance, but not Port Hardy.
Right. I don't know that I have a really clearly logical answer for that. Well, I guess it was because, there is no five-star hotel in Quatsino. And I guess it felt a little bit weird to write something set in Quatsino with a fictional hotel.
Right.
If you're doing that, like just fictionalize the whole thing. Whereas I know there's a high school in Port Hardy. So like that felt like less of a leap that, yeah, I guess that was it.
Right.
It felt more logical to fictionalize one than the other.
Right.
I
And
think,
the arrival, departure.
right. I think that's always on my mind. I don't know if it's related to BC ferries or not, but I left Canada when I was 22 and then again when I was 23. And until the pandemic, I was constantly coming back. I used to come back between 2 and 4 times a year. And, both British Columbia and New York City feel like home in a way. I have such deep ties to both places at this point. So, yeah, I've spent a lot of my life arriving and departing.
Right. Yeah. And so Allison wants to know, how involved were you in the HBO adaptation of Station 11? And when is it due to come out? And I will extend that a little further and say if you can comment on The Glass Hotel
Yeah, sure.
and movie rights.
Yeah, no problem. I had really zero involvement in Station 11, except that I'm friends with the showrunner, Patrick Somerville. I met Patrick when he was a novelist in Chicago, and I've watched him build this incredible career. He moved from Chicago to Los Angeles and kind of segued into television writing and then show running, which is what it sounds like. He's running the show. So he did offer me a spot in the writer's room on Station 11. But by the time that happened, like by the time that show became real, I was so deeply in the Glass Hotel that that was all I was thinking about. So going to Station 11 kind of felt like moving backwards. I just wanted to focus on the new project. So what that means is that the Station 11 project has just kind of rolled ahead without me, which is kind of nice. If it's terrible, it's not my fault, which I appreciate. But I don't think it will be terrible. I think it'll be great. I really trust Patrick with the material. As a novelist, he has kind of a sensitivity, I guess, to not mangling the story. That being said, I think it will be quite different from the book, just because different genres have different dramatic requirements.
Right.
It just has to be much more heightened for television and movies than it does on the page.
Yes.
So I actually don't know when it comes out. I'm pretty sure they have a release date, but that's a closely guarded secret that I'm not privy to.
The Glass Hotel is also going to be a series, is it?
I hope so. Yeah, that is much earlier on in the process. And that one I am working on. I'm going to be the head writer if it goes ahead. And my friend and colleague, Semi Chellis, another Canadian who lives in Los Angeles, is going to be the showrunner. So, we're hoping to pitch it in the next few weeks and to try to find a home for it. an HBO Max or a Netflix or something.
Yeah.
It's a really strange time for television. The pandemic has kind of thrown everything off, and it's unclear what will become of any of these projects. But it would be. I hope it goes ahead. I really enjoyed writing for TV.
Oh, really? What other writing for TV have you done?
Just The Glass Hotel. I've written
Oh,
the
just
first two
Glass.
episodes.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
really? Oh, wow. And how does that differ from writing a novel?
It's it feels easier, which is not quite fair to say, because I think it's much easier to write a bad novel than it is to write a good television episode. But there's just this kind of speed to it that I love. It's much faster. It's collaborative, and that's really an experience I've never had before. But
Yeah,
with
I know.
with my fiction, I am really intensely edited, so there is a collaborative process toward the end of the writing. But with television, I'm going back and forth with my co-writer from the very beginning. And the way that process would often work is I would write a draft of something and then I'd email it to Semi, and then it would just come back magically 100 times better. It just felt really fun. So, yeah, so it's that. I think it's also just the pleasure of doing something new. I love
Well,
writing
yeah.
novels, and also after 6 novels, it's kind of fun to do something different.
One of my books has been adapted for the stage, and I felt the same way there, that it was, oh my goodness, I would just like a troupe of actors in my study all the time, right? That I could
Yeah.
just kind of feed lines to, and then they would, oh no, that doesn't work. That's not a real conversation at all. Right.
Right.
It was just an amazing, it opened your eyes to different genres, right?
Yeah,
It's, yeah.
absolutely. And I don't know what your experience was, but it gave me a whole new appreciation for that thing where you see an adaptation of a book you loved and you're like, "Ah, it was totally different from the book." It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, because it
And
had
now
to
you
be.
know why.
Yeah, now I know why. Exactly.
Yeah. Can you talk just ever so briefly? By my count, we have another 3 minutes. Yeah. About the Millions. Are you still a staff writer at the Millions?
I'm really only on paper. I haven't written for them for years. I really love the Millions. I just
Can
haven't
you
been able.
tell people what it
Yeah,
is?
sure.
Because
It's a
I'm not
great.
sure it's hugely well known here.
Yeah, it might not be. It's a really good literary website. They do great essays and book reviews. I read it pretty often, even though I haven't written for it in a very long time. That's
But you
themillions.com.
did do a couple of, well, you did some wonderful pieces, but
Thank
you
you.
also did 2 sort of analytical projects.
That was
for them.
really fun. Yeah, I was.
Well, I loved both of them.
Thank you.
So tell us about them briefly.
Sure. Okay. It's been years, so you might have to correct me if
Yeah.
I get this wrong. But I noticed a certain trend in titles, girl titles. The girl with the dragon tattoo, the girl in the red dress, the girl on the train, so yeah, that was one of them that I did. I did an analysis of who the girls were, how likely they were to end up dead, how that broke out by the gender of the author. It was really interesting. And then
And
the
you
other
found
one,
that male
Oh.
authors more often kill off their girls, right?
yeah, which in fairness, what we need to acknowledge is that authors do not have absolute control over their titles. So it's very likely that a large percentage of these authors had titles imposed by the publishing house. But it was interesting. Oh, and then the other one, which was more fun, was the daughter books. The judge's daughter, the detective's daughter, the weaver's daughter, the apothecary's daughter. There are so many of them. And yeah, that was really fun, just breaking down who are these women, whose daughters are they? And yeah, I don't remember all the analyses I ran, but I was an administrative assistant for 12 years. So I had pretty good Excel skills, and it was really fun to use Excel for book titles.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. Well, we are, 10 seconds away from the end of our hour. So I wanted to thank you. I'm not sure. Oh, here comes Daphne. She's going to do that too. But I personally want to thank you, Emily, because that was a really great conversation. So
it was. And thank you so much for doing this. I know these things take a ton of preparation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's very fun.
Well, and I have to tell you, we appreciate both of you. Thank you so much for this wonderful hour. And thank you all out there for joining us this evening or this afternoon if you're on the West Coast. I hope you enjoyed hearing from our author and our interviewer. And this interview will be available on our YouTube channel in the upcoming days. So please check that out, or, send it to a friend who wanted to be here this evening or this afternoon and couldn't. And please join us on July 26th when our next book club will happen, and Michael Redhill will be our interviewer, and Seth, author of Clyde Fans, will be here to be interviewed. So if you have subscribed to our book club mailing list, you will be sent a registration notification. And if you're not part of that list, please register for our next book club, which should be fascinating. So again, thank you, Emily. Thank you, Marilyn. And thank you all. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.